All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Keith. I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose Bookstore. I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these extraordinary times. Throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Missionaries on Politics and Prose's website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we do apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful for our families, to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce our event tonight. Phil Klay, a veteran of the Marines, won the National Book Award in 2014 for his collection of short stories, Redeployment. Now, with the highly anticipated debut novel, Missionaries, he explores the present and future of a globalized, technological, and interconnected battlefield of war. 4 characters' lives intertwined during a rescue mission at a drug trafficker's safe house in Colombia, what is considered to be one of our good wars. It is sweeping and expansive, well-paced and nuanced. A look at how one influences and utilizes power abroad and how it is all connected within the global system. He will be joined in conversation by Kirstin Valdez Quade, a professor of creative writing at Princeton University and the writer of the highly acclaimed short story collection, Night at the Fiestas. Her new book, The 5 Wounds, will be out in April. So please join me in welcoming Phil Klay and Kirstin Valdez Quade to PNP Live.
Thank you so much. Hey, how's it going?
Good. It's such a joy to be here at Politics and Prose to celebrate your gorgeous, gorgeous new novel. I'm so delighted to get to be here to talk with you about it.
I couldn't be more pleased. And just also say, I'm really looking forward to 5 Wounds. So it's going to be fantastic. I'm certain.
Well,
and I've got Night at the Fiestas right here, which neatly has like the same color scheme as Missionaries. So we coordinated, I guess.
We should do that with all our books.
I agree. I agree.
So Phil, we had thought that you might start by reading from the novel and introducing us a bit to the world of Missionaries.
Absolutely. So the novel starts out from the voices of 4 different characters and then moves later to a third person perspective. But I thought I would just, to give a flavor of the novel, do 2 short readings from two of the Colombian narrators, actually. So the first is Abel, and this is just his first chapter. So, my town sat on top of a small hill by the side of a river whose banks held only sand. At noon, you had to walk quickly so as not to burn your feet, but when it rained, the river would overflow and turn our central street to mud. All us children would go out, slipping and pushing each other, playing in the mud before the sun baked it hard and the wind carried it away as dust. To talk about this part of my life is to talk about another person, like a person in a story, a boy with a father and mother and 3 sisters, one pretty, one smart, one mean, a grandfather who drank too much and beat everyone at dominoes, a teacher who thought that boy had talent, a priest who thought he was wicked, friends and classmates and enemies and girls he watched with increasing wonder, like Jimena, who had thick curly hair and fair skin and who got pregnant with the baby of one of the local guerrilleros. Most people think that a person is whatever you see before you, walking around in bone and meat and blood, but that is an idiocy. Bone and meat and blood just exists, but to exist is not to live, and bone and meat and blood alone is not a person. A person is what happens when there is a family and a town, a place where you are known, where every person who knows you holds a small, invisible mirror, and in each mirror, held by family and friends and enemies, is a different reflection. In one mirror, the sweet, fat boy I was to my mother, in another, the little imp I was to my father, in another, the irritating brat I was to Gustavo. A person is what happens when you gather all these reflections around a body. So what happens when one by one, the people holding those mirrors are taken from you? It's simple. The person dies, and the bone and meat and blood goes on, walking the earth as if the person still existed when God and the angels know he doesn't. So that's Abel. And here's Juan Pablo, who is a lieutenant colonel in the Colombian military. There's a gringa hen and a Colombian pig. And one day the hen says to the pig, "We've known each other for so long, and we've always done well together. We should start a business." And the Colombian pig thinks, "Yes, I have known this gringa a long time, though I'm not so sure I've always done well by her. Still, she's always done well. So perhaps going into business together will work out for me too." And the Colombian pig says, "What is this business?" And the gringa hen says, "We'll sell breakfast sandwiches. I'll provide half the ingredients, you provide the other half." "That sounds fair," says the Colombian pig. "What's your contribution?" "The eggs, clearly," says the gringa hen. "Clearly, yes," says the Colombian pig. "And what about me?" The gringa hen smiles. She lays a wing on the pig's shoulder. "You, my sweet Colombian pig, you'll provide the bacon." My daughter told me that story. My daughter Valencia, she heard it from her professor of law, who is, like seemingly every professor of law at Nacional, very much a man of the left. She told it to me the way she tells me every little excess or flourish of her professors, with an eye roll. "Not quite a memento, but almost," she said, echoing what I have told her often before, but for perhaps the first time I detected a question behind her eyes. Perhaps she herself did not know it was hiding there. "There's some truth to that," I told her. But I didn't say more. We don't talk about my work. It's not appropriate for children to know more about it than the honor it's due. And I still think of her 20 years old, beautiful, with her mother's eyes and, unfortunately, my weak chin, as a child. But it is true. I, more than anyone would know, after all, for the past 20 years, I have been the bacon. So that's Juan Pablo and Abel.
Great. I'm so happy you started by reading from those sections. I love both of those characters so much. And the opening of the novel in Abel's point of view is just stunning. And I especially love your description, Abel's description of what makes a person, that we are who we are because we're reflected in the people who love us. And as you read, he says that the person dies if all of those reflections die. And in Abel's case, he dies early. I mean,
Right.
we meet him as this sweet, fat child in this, vivid, bright landscape of his village. And then he loses everything. And we follow him into adulthood as he gets a powerful position in a paramilitary group under Jefferson, this man he disdains and admires and fears. And I was wondering if you would talk about what that means for Abel, that this character that we come to love and is lost in his own eyes so early.
Yeah, and becomes wrapped up in a truly brutal group, right? It was important to me to start there. And I think one of the things that the novel is concerned with more broadly is the way you have these sort of broad, abstract kind of systems of violence, right? That are kind of moving around the globe. And then you have these local communities that are so important. I always think of there's a beautiful passage from the writer Vasily Grossman, Soviet writer who was with the Red Army in World War II, whose mother was executed as Jewish, and his mother was executed by the Nazis. And at one point he passed through a town where everyone had been executed, and he writes, these are different from the deaths of men who will go away to war. Where there's this community that they could come back to. This is not just the death of individual people, and he lists all the individual people. It's the murder of of songs, of memory, of traditions that have been moving side by side for generations. There's something sort of beautiful and precious and organic, right? That grows up when you have people together in a community, and that can be fragile and can be destroyed. And it's something that exists at the level of community, but it's something that can be sort of shown at the level of the human soul. It's funny. There's I think in the first story, Night of the Fiestas, there's that sort of beautiful moment where the narrator's older cousin becomes a teenager and stops paying attention to her, and she like becomes insubstantial, and I think we all sort of feel that. In America, we have this very kind of individualistic sense of what it is to be a human being, but when those other people and that culture and community is stripped from you, what do you have left? And what do you do when you nevertheless have to go on living? And what compromises do you make to survive?
I mean, so much of this novel is about your characters' compromises. I mean, every single one of them is there are all these conflicting allegiances with
Right.
country and family and religion, and every single one of them is compromised, which makes, it's part of what makes this book so rich and complicated, because each of these characters is being pulled. That's a abstract question, but will you
Sure.
talk about that?
All the characters have their own kind of idealism in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And oftentimes a faith in what they're doing, that then, is always kind of sort of run up against the difficulties of the world, the kind of corruption of the institutions that they're a part of, right? And the limitations of those institutions. And then just sort of there's always this, I think, negotiation between pragmatism and idealism, and then also kind of, the possibility of corruption lying in the heart of it, right? That I think all of us feel to some extent. And it's funny, I was talking with a Jesuit last week, Father Tom at Fairfield University, and he was saying, in the Gospels, what is the sin that Jesus rails against more than almost any other? Religious hypocrisy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Constantly. And he says, in all my years in the confessional, and Father Tom's in his 80s, in all my years in the confessional, no one has ever come into the confessional and said, I've been a religious hypocrite, right? And yet, whatever the faith of these characters, be it in an actual religion, in a certain type of progress, in their institutions that they're a part of, in what can be done with the written word, right? For Lisette, there's also their career and their attraction to this world, and all sorts of other kind of demands on them, where at every stage they're being asked to make moral choices, and I think that's a description of the characters in the book, but I think it's something that all of us face.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the tiny ways in which these characters redeem themselves or
Yeah.
think they're redeeming themselves. Sticking with Abel, one of the most moving threads for me was his preoccupation with Luisa, this woman who he was a part of wounding so horribly, and yet there's a kind of, I don't think it's going too far to say there's a kind of love there. She's,
yes.
I'm so interested in that relationship. And he says at one point that he is alive because he saved her, that, he takes solace in that as horrible as the violence is that he participates in perpetrating on her and her family and her life, he saves her.
Yeah. So what happens with Abel is he ends up in this right-wing paramilitary group, but he kind of becomes the civil affairs guy for this group. So that, he's in this region of Colombia where the actual state has very little presence, right? But it's on the border with Venezuela. There's people are growing coca, there's drug trafficking through this region. It's a sort of place that's never going to be important to the central government of Colombia, but will always be important to gangs and other sort of factions that are vying for control of this region. And so he ends up in this group, and they function at times almost like a government, right? Which various of these groups do in sort of often rather rough ways. And they'll also sort of siphon, kind of government money and take credit for the things that they allow to happen there. And so he gets in that section of the work. But because he's focused on sort of local politics and building problems and those other things, that's all becomes directly related to the violence. So there's a political scientist, Abby Steele, is fantastic, who's shown how the right-wing paramilitary groups would actually use election returns to determine which towns needed to be targeted, right, for forced displacement and terrorizing. And so he is part of this campaign to target Luisa's village, but like the one thing that he wants to recoup is that he'll save her, right? That he's never going to let his boss know that she's actually a political player there, that she's actually has there's a sort of force of personality to her that he can see even at that stage. And then you meet her much later in her life in the novel, when she's running this local group working with victims of the violence. And so, yeah, Abel is kind of always longing for redemption, for the things, he feels this weight of what he's been a part of. And this longing to return to a community that's not marred by violence, where he can just kind of walk down the street and be known not as, Jefferson's henchman, but as a decent man.
It's so painful. I mean, because his history is so full of his violence and misdeeds. It's hard to read that longing that he has. And we're constantly aware of that vision of his early childhood from the opening chapter that he misses so much. You read Juan Pablo's opening paragraph, right, this lieutenant colonel, and we are introduced very briefly to Valencia in that section you read. I loved the relationship between Juan Pablo and his daughter, and she's in college, she's in law school, and she's developing beliefs of her own. She's coming to terms with her own father's role in Colombia's violence. And there's that wonderful moment when he's trying to shape her politics, and he gives her a stack of books. And you write so beautifully in both Juan Pablo's section and in Mason's section about fatherhood. And I was hoping you would talk about fatherhood and especially about Juan Pablo's relationship with his daughter.
I mean, can you tell that I became a father while writing this book? I've got 3 kids now, and the book is dedicated to my wife and to my 2 oldest children. Sorry, Lucas, but you weren't around while I was writing the book, so
too late, buddy.
The latest one is I'm going to have to write another book to dedicate to him. The funny thing about Valencia is, Juan Pablo is his lieutenant colonel. He very much. He's very intellectual. He's smart. He's sort of right wing, though not kind of like he's not sort of far right wing as far as the Colombian military goes. He has a kind of pragmatic sensibility. He's sort of willing to admit to a certain level of violence and atrocity that the Colombian military has been a part of. And he sort of accepts that as the price of doing business, right? And at one point he says of his daughter that, she's a law student, she's studying human rights. at this university that's kind of known for having, being left wing, and famously one, I think it was like the child of a Colombian general ended up joining a guerrilla group years before. And he is looking at his daughter and thinking like, his job is to make Colombia safe and secure. And then if her generation can ever, look upon mine with contempt, it'll only mean that my life's work will have been successful, right? And that's kind of how he views what he's been a part of. And at the same time, he wants to shape her. He wants to mold her. He wants, she's his kind of hope for the future, but he wants, to control it. And she's not going to be controlled, right? And she's not going to see the world that he does. And there's naivete in her, but also she sees some things that he doesn't. And so their relationship is this kind of critical part of the book. And the funny thing about writing it is she wasn't originally part of the plan, right? I started writing this sort of encounter between Mason, who's an American Special Forces medic who you first meet in Iraq. And then like the conversation wasn't working. So I had to create another character. And so I created a daughter for him, right? And then all of a sudden I just became much more interested in their relationship. And it sort of, grew into this whole thing about, what he wants to achieve in his life, how he wants to see his life, what kind of legacy he wants to leave, what his relationship with her is, what her, view of her own father is, and her relationship to this, everything that he's leaving her, just became a critical part of the book. And sort of funny, I think it's funny. A famous author once told me never to have children if I wanted to be a writer, and I was telling that to a buddy of mine, and he was like, "Why would you cut yourself off from like such a major human experience as a writer? That's crazy." But I mean, like, yeah, you have certainly less time to write, and you're more exhausted. But I would like to think that it is, added to make the work richer. I hope, anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And in Mason's section too, he's when we meet him, he's about to become a father. So he's teetering on the edge of that. And, so much of his arc is about how to talk to his wife about his experiences. And
yeah. And he's thinking, he's in Iraq and he's thinking, and, his first really intense deployment. And he's thinking about the kind of things that he would have said about why he was there at the time versus what it actually was. And what it actually was, there's a part of him that just loves it, right? Mm-hmm. He loves being out on these missions with these other guys and the sort of intensity of the experience and the feeling of purpose that you have, even as he starts throughout the course of his chapters to become more and more cynical about whether the strategy that America is pursuing, particularly in Afghanistan, where the way that we started using special forces in Afghanistan in the first decade of the 21st century sort of shifted, where they were originally supposed to be the warrior diplomats, and then just kind of institution building went out the window. I was interviewing an SF guy, and he said, we go back to the same valleys year after year. And we weren't bringing, we weren't building schools or roads or helping with local government. We didn't have any money for that. We're just doing interdiction mission after interdiction mission, getting into these gnarly firefights against these kids. Like the Taliban was sending kids against us, and we chew them up because we're really good at our jobs, right? And I would wonder, like, why are they doing this, sending these kids against us to get chewed up? And it was a while before I realized, they're doing it because they can, right? Mm-hmm. And nobody thought that there was going to be, that the second that they left, that the Taliban wouldn't come back. And yet, in the moment, it feels momentous, right? And so he's got this kind of conflict between what he's sort of intellectually understanding about the flaws in the way that his life and the lives of the men around him are being used. And because he's a medic, there are times in the book where their lives are literally in his hands, right? And the intensity of the feeling of purpose and meaning that he gets from being there, and the thrill of it.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up we meet Mason in Iraq, and we meet Lizette in Afghanistan. The bulk of the novel takes place in Colombia. We eventually end up in Yemen. Will you, I mean, that is, the novel has an extraordinary reach and depth, you know, geographically, temporally, in terms of the number of point of view characters and characters in general. Will you talk about that, that capaciousness of the novel? And as a writer, a fellow writer, I'm interested also in how you juggle it.
Yeah. So it had to be that way in order to do what I wanted to do, because, you know, I felt that I wanted to talk about modern war, right? And the way that I think it's changed, and you know, my first book was about Iraq, specifically about Iraq, and specifically about the experiences of soldiers and Marines in Iraq. But the more that I've, you know, sort of read and thought about war, the more it seems insufficient to just talk about one theater of conflict, right? In terms of how America projects power around the world, how we're reshaping the world through violence. When you have a situation where you can have, say, a Colombian mercenary on an Emirati airbase watching a Yemeni tribesman through a Chinese-made drone before killing him with an American-supplied missile, right? You're talking about something that's very complex, right? And that's involving a lot of different countries. And Colombia is kind of a perfect case for that. I mean, on the one level, it made sense for me to write about Colombia because my wife is a Colombian American. We have family in Medellin. It was very easy to go and, you know, visit family and do research, and they helped me. Just were tremendous in helping me find people to interview in Colombia, but and just kind of resource in general. But also, there's been a tremendous cross-pollination between Colombia and other theaters of conflict. Every ambassador that we sent to Colombia post 9/11 has gone on to be involved in the Afghan war in some capacity. 2 ambassadors post 9/11, their next posting after being the ambassador to Colombia was to be the ambassador to Afghanistan. And then meanwhile, you have sort of military units like 7th Group, which is what Mason is a part of, who sort of toggle back and forth between Latin America and Iraq and Afghanistan. And then there are sort of types of tactics that sort of migrate. So targeted killing is one thing that the novel is very concerned with, the way that we do targeted assassinations now, right? And, you know, targeted assassination is like, it's like the big thing that politicians like to brag about. Obama's last State of the Union, he bragged about the Osama bin Laden raid and the sort of getting the Benghazi planner. Donald Trump likes to brag about the Soleimani raid, right? Now, are things better on the ground after the raid has happened, after the violence has been done, right? We recently threatened to withdraw all our personnel from our embassy in Baghdad because the Iranian-backed militias have been much more active in threatening people working with, you know, the American embassy. But that system of violence, right? So to give an example, Joint Special Operations is doing 12 raids a month in 2004, 250 by 2006, right? That's because the way in which we did targeted killing radically shifted, right? And sort of was kind of pumped up to an industrial scale. And it wasn't about necessarily like Navy SEALs or Army Rangers or an intelligence service or a new technology, but rather about the systems by which we sort of bring all those together, bring the people from various agencies together and have a very tight system for finding targets, killing them, generating more intelligence and acting on that intelligence. That system is lethal, right? And while most people think the drone that kills somebody is kind of creepy, right? A mechanical drone killing somebody from afar, and a Navy SEAL killing somebody, that's kind of cool, your average American thinks. From the perspective of the targeting system, that's just the flathead and Phillips head screwdriver, right? At the end of that system. And we applied that system to Colombia, right? In the mid 2000s and started helping them kill leaders of these communist guerrilla groups. And so it was this kind of perfect theater of conflict that most Americans don't know about, but that we're heavily involved in. We've been the largest, it's been the largest recipient of military aid in the Western Hemisphere since the end of the Clinton administration, right? Actually, Joe Biden was a big part of putting that together. And it's this place where lessons we're trying to export, lessons from Colombia to Afghanistan, things that we develop in Iraq are coming and being used in Colombia. And so I wanted to find a way to get at that complexity in a way that didn't feel like a sort of academic paper, right? But where I think when you're writing about war, you have an obligation to make it viscerally felt, right? What does this mean? All of that stuff that I just said are things that happen to actual human bodies, right? And things that happen in actual human communities that get radically reshaped by the violence that is then done, right? And what does that look like? What does it look like on the ground? What does it look like from the perspective of the local Colombian forces, right? From the Americans who are working with them, from a journalist who is trying to get her hands on the big picture and then just sort of transmit that knowledge back to an American audience. And if you sort of put all those things in the stories and lives of individual people, then you can just kind of have them sort of work their way together, because that's actually how the world works, right? That these things from all these different places do actually meet in tiny rural regions in Colombia and have effects that the people who do the violence are never going to see. But in a novel, you can show all the layers, and you can show not just the kind of abstract idea of what's happening, but how it is felt on a human level at each part of that chain.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be very vague about this, but in your last chapter, we see that happen. We see this high level vision, and then the specific individual in a really devastating and beautiful way. So you mentioned Lizette, the journalist, and you have a lot of storytellers in this novel, but she's the one who makes her living as a storyteller, and she talks about, when we meet her in Afghanistan, she talks about her job. She says, the key is finding a detail that might make some reader looking over the morning paper, drinking coffee, eating a hard-boiled egg, about to rush to work, to make that person stop and care. And I think that's getting at what you're talking about, that all of the geopolitics have to come down to the individual. We have to be able to see these individual characters, the specificity of each person's experience of that violence. And I mean, that's something the novel does so beautifully. Lizette's such an interesting character, though, because she also is so jaded. She's exhausted by her work in Afghanistan, and she goes home and sort of lies around her mother's house in Pennsylvania. She's just wiped out by the work until she gets to Colombia. And will you talk about Lizette and both this urgency to tell these stories and tell them in a compelling way that makes her audience care, because we have to care.
Right.
And also, there is something a little careerist about her.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. She has a kind of crisis of faith in her own profession after these kind of 3 bombings that happen in Kabul. And she sort of goes back to recuperate and spends time in Johnstown, Pennsylvania with her family, and then later in New York. And after a while, it's just like, I need another war. Like, I need another war, but I want one where we're winning. And she reaches out to a mercenary that she used to date named Diego, who becomes sort of more of a character later on. And he tells her to go to Colombia because, of course, Colombia's on the verge of signing this peace treaty with the FARC, in theory, ending the longest sort of insurgency in the world, though the violence has not certainly stopped since that peace treaty was signed. And she starts out thinking, okay, you have to find the detail that makes somebody care. But then she's also worried, like, is even that enough, right? The kind of empathetic detail. And what is the framing that's going to make this meaningful and intelligible to somebody, where they can sort of look at this incredibly complicated version of modern war and be able to act in response to it. And there's a later passage where she's talking with Diego about Michael Hare's Dispatches, right, which is this brilliant nonfiction book about the Vietnam War, and how the journalist John Sack had once said that the thing that was so brilliant about Dispatches was that Hare, unlike all the other reporters who, when they were sort of exhausted out in the field, would kind of go back and recuperate and rest and try and get an understanding what the big picture was, Hare understood that going insane in the field, getting exhausted, losing track of things, losing your mind a bit, was part of the experience, and that had to be captured at the level of the prose in order to actually get what was really essential about this experience. And that's why Sack thought that Hare had written the best piece of journalism about Vietnam. But then she's thinking, but that's not the right thing for this war, right? Because this isn't Vietnam insanity. This is a different kind of rational insanity, where you have like a million little mission sets and these highly professional career military officers who, sort of, if you look at each individual mission, it all makes sense. But from the sort of broader picture, you just have this kind of accumulating disaster. None of them are actually integrated, and it's just kind of like, not sort of pot and LSD insanity of the Woodstock generation, but like a kind of rational insanity of the sort of Adderall and iPhone generation. And how do you write that? How do you get your handle? How do you get a handle on that type of warfare and that aspect of how sort of violence is happening around the world? And that is kind of her search, which leads her into trouble.
Does lead her into trouble. I just want to take a moment to just remind the audience that we are open to questions, and you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we have a question already in here, and this is from Mindy, and she and I have the same question, in fact, and it's about research. I mean, in your acknowledgements, it's so clear that a huge amount of research went into this book. Will you talk about the process of researching? And yeah, and again, as a fellow writer, I have questions about, how do you manage all of that research? I mean, because in any one of these books that you cite in your acknowledgements, there would be a huge amount of information.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not so disciplined and organized in the research that I do. I kind of just go down insane rabbit holes, I guess. But they're kind of different levels of the research. So there's the kind of like factual details about what kind of weapons might they have? How do you manually compress an aorta? The book Top Knife will tell you. Excellent guide to surgery. And that sort of stuff. And then there's just kind of like this sort of general reading that I'm kind of constantly doing about these different theaters of conflict. I'm interested in it in general. So, even before I started this novel, I knew a lot about the various pieces. And so I'll kind of, over time, just sort of gradually accumulate a larger and larger amount of information in my head. I did at one point have a kind of like insane serial killer wall where I had like little Post-it notes everywhere on my office. But the thing about that insane serial killer wall was like, it was just for me organizing the information in my own head at the time. It never really worked its way into the novel exactly. I find if I know only a few things about, say, like how the Colombian military was operating, I'll then feel obliged to use all those things. Whereas what I actually want is this sort of like constellation of just stuff above my head while I'm writing. And as I'm writing, I can go like, oh, that'll be useful, right? So it started off reading a lot of journalism, reading a lot of also like, you know, literature, right? Colombian novelists and poets as well. I'll read things that are sort of more philosophical, you know, Hannah Arendt and Jean Amarie's kind of reflections on being tortured by the Gestapo and being sent to Auschwitz were important for example, some of the Abel chapters. And then just, you know, talking to people. So when you interact with human beings who have these experiences, I think they just hit you in a different way. And so you feel when you write, even if you're not taking the story exactly, when you write in relationship to what you've been told, there's a different fire going on there. And it can be, you know, I'll tell you a story. I did an interview with this guy who'd grown up in a paramilitary town where Carlos Castaño used to go drinking. And my wife's cousin went with me. She's from Medellin, and her father thought it would be interesting to her to go along with me for some of my interviews to learn more about our country. And so he's telling us these stories about his childhood and what it was like in this town. And when we walked away, you know, I turned to my wife's cousin. She's, I think, like 17 or 18 at the time. And I said, oh, that was a fantastic interview, you know? And her face was white. And she said to me, she said, only now do I know how lucky I've been my whole life. And I felt a bit like a ghoul, you know, sort of vampire, like, yes, you know, you're sort of terrible stories from your childhood. But it was a good kind of reminder to me, I guess, that there's a way in which when you're writing about things, you can sometimes become abstracted from them. But the actual, you know, talking to human beings is makes you feel a responsibility in a different way. And so I think that's a really important part of it. The other, and then just sometimes people will let loose things. It's like there's a bit in the novel. Well, I was talking to a guy who's in the special forces. I think it was actually interviewing him while he was in Afghanistan, and he was talking about how good the medics were, and he was like, "Yeah, you know, and like sometimes they'll do like before we went back on our last deployment, they did that surgery for guys for free. What is it where like if you don't want more kids?" And I was like, "Are you saying they did tabletop vasectomies?" And he's like, "Oh, maybe you shouldn't put that in the book." I was like, "I'm definitely putting that in the book. What are you, crazy?"
You'd be a fool not to.
Yeah.
Phil, I wanted to, so the vote over the peace treaty between the FARC and the Colombian government looms over the novel. You know, in that first conversation between Juan Pablo and Mason, that becomes the big topic of conversation. And, you know, Juan Pablo's family is staunchly against it. And, you know, so this question of reconciliation and how do we come to terms with past wrongs is such a big part of this novel. And on the individual level, we see it in the characters' attempts to make sense of and make amends for their actions. And at one point, I mean, we see it with Abel, of course, and Luisa, and at one point, Juan Pablo's wife insists that he go to confession. And I was wondering if you would talk about reconciliation, both on, you know, the individual level and on the broader political, you know, societal level.
Well, one of the things with a conflict like this is you have multiple sides who have done things you can't be undone, right? And how do you move to a place of reconciliation where true justice is kind of inconceivable, right? What would true justice mean in the wake of widespread atrocities on both sides, right? What would that kind of accounting be, and how much would it rend a society to do that kind of accounting, right? And one of the sort of interesting things about the lead up to there was this very divisive and also often very deceitful campaign, the run up to this vote as to whether or not to sign a peace treaty with the FARC, and the FARC was hated, and hated for many good reasons, right? The politician who was leading the charge against the peace treaty had signed a sort of even more generous, far more generous treaty with right-wing paramilitary groups who had done even more brutal things, but of course he considered them on his side, right? And so one of the things that Lisette mentioned, talks about is the way that the stories of the victimized, right, can have a political salience in many different directions, right, and can be used to justify continuing war, right, in continuing violence, when theoretically the purpose of waging war is to achieve a sort of stable political settlement, and and so that's and the peace treaty with the FARC was ultimately rejected by the people, but then they sort of went forward and did it anyway after some changes to it. So it seemed like the perfect place to situate this novel, where the stories of the victimized and like questions of human rights are being leveraged by people with a lot of blood on their hands and a lot of human rights abuses that they have to account for in order to continue a very aggressive campaign that people in the regions most affected by the violence did not want to continue. And yet, it's not as though there wasn't a kernel of truth in the argument, right? Because ending a war like this means letting people off the hook to a certain degree for, we're not talking about minor sins. We're talking about rape, torture, murder, displacement of people, some of the worst things that you can imagine. And there's justice, there's society moving forward, right? Which is a different thing. Society progressing. There's the goal of peace. There's revenge, and then there's also mercy, right? Which is something that Valencia introduces into the conversation, right? And mercy is, of course, necessarily an injustice. Mercy implies not making somebody pay for what they've done.
Yeah. Chris asks about the title of the novel. What do you see as the connection in the book and in our culture between religious proselytizing and American militarization?
Yeah. Well, I think it cuts in different directions, right? So some of the people doing work in the novel are in opposition to a sort of the military actions, or are motivated by religious faith. There's God, I forget. I think his name is Mahidi. He's a chaplain in Vietnam. Referred to our it's like our militarized Christ, sort of like American warrior God, and so I think that there is a kind of like particular type of faith in American exceptionalism and the American role around the world that does have a sort of missionary zeal to it. that is often blind to what the ultimate consequences of some of our interventions, that places far too much faith in our ability to reshape cultures that we don't know a lot about. And yeah, I'm not the relationship between violence and religion is a complicated one, because of course, Christianity is, on the one hand, an odd faith to use to justify violence, and yet of course it's been done time and time again.
Who are the missionaries of the title?
I think all the characters are reshaping the world in different ways, and they're part of institutions that are reshaping the world. And sometimes they think those institutions and the things that they're doing are maybe more value neutral than they actually are, right? And so I think that I talked earlier about the kind of like these sort of broader instrumental processes, these systems in place that kind of want more targets, right? So one of the things is, like, in the wake of the peace treaty, the Colombian military wants to take over Operation Agamemnon, which is a real thing. Prior to the peace treaty, it was run by the police. It was going after this one criminal gang. After the peace treaty, the military took it over, and so the drug dealers stopped going into prisons, started going into body bags. And one reason for the military to want to do that is just to have a job, right? A new mission, to still be in the mix. And on the one level, that's not particularly ideological, and yet it has profound effects and reshapes the communities where that violence is done, which is what the novel is concerned with. And so all of the characters are missionaries to a certain extent, and they're constantly negotiating their sort of faith in what they're doing with the institutions they're a part of, and the kind of institutional inertia of the institutions that they're a part of. Because if you look at and then versus what kind of grows up organically on the ground, and if you look at the past 20 years of American warfare, like, intellectually, we've learned about the limits of what you can do purely with military power. Intellectually, we've learned about the necessity of different types of American power. But what have we done practically? We've gutted the State Department, and we've built up a highly sophisticated machine for killing people abroad, right? And so sort of what you build up institutionally is ultimately what you believe in the end.
Kevin asks if this novel grew out of redeployment in any way, and how you handled the shift from the short story to the novel.
Yeah, as I was writing Redeployment, the stories kept getting longer and longer. The longest stories in that book are the last ones that were written, and I think that just sort of what I wanted to say and what felt vital to me started demanding longer forms, right? And so by the time I had finished Redeployment, and I started this novel 6 years ago, so before Redeployment actually came out, I had already started thinking about how I was going to put these things together. I knew that I wanted to take on something that would sort of bring these different strands together, and to talk about a topic like this. I always want my writing to be as lean as possible. I don't want to just sort of go off on random tangents. I want my work to move and to be chained to what is essential that I'm trying to communicate, because I feel when I'm writing that there's something really urgent, that I want to communicate to the reader, and I don't want to sort of go off and be like, oh, and a squirrel. I like squirrels, but as much as the next man. But there was no way to talk about this subject without doing it in a longer form. And the structure of the novel is related to sort of what what I felt was kind of essential to get across. It's sort of 4 first-person narratives, almost like 4 sort of novellas, where you get these characters with their own sort of narrative of their life, bringing them to this point. And then in the final half of the novel, the sort of social world of the novel expands, right? And the scope expands. And the, the kind of worldviews of your first person narrators are no longer in charge of guiding you through what's happening. And what's happening, I would hope, puts pressure on the types of stories that the narrators are telling you in the first part of the book.
Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful way to play with point of view. The way you play with form there works really beautifully.
Thank you. We're writing it. I was like, all right, this is weird. I hope I hope it works.
I think it does. So in Missionaries, you show an American civilian reader this view of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. military involvement that can be pretty uncomfortable, and some of the novel's conclusions are pretty bleak. Do you see a possibility for hope for another way?
Yeah, I do. I wouldn't write if I didn't have hope, but I think you have to see clearly in order to change anything, right? I think we do learn things as a country slowly. I don't think we're in a great spot right now in terms of leadership. I didn't have a ton of expectation that the current president was going to put us on a radically different course, or fix a lot of the things that I thought were sort of structurally wrong with the way that we wage war. And so, it's not like for the past 4 years I've been waiting for like some tremendous thing that was going to, make the way that America does foreign policy and military policy so much better. But in the ways that we have used the military, in many ways, we just kind of followed from the Obama administration. And there's sort of more interesting continuities than I think a lot of people realize. But no, I mean, I think that especially if you look at history, it's not like there was like a golden age where we were doing everything awesome. So I think, on the one hand, you have to have like a certain degree of expectation that there's going to be corruption in the world, that we live in a sort of fallen world, and men are fallen creatures, and we're going to do evil, and the institutions that we're going to build are going to bear that same sin. But at the same time, that there are possibilities for redemption, that there are possibilities for and they're truly good people doing truly heroic work, and that there is always a possibility to make things better, whether at the local level or sort of to sort of, each individual sort of pushing against the institutions that they're a part of to try and knock them ever so slightly on a better course. I think it's often tempting when you look at the sort of scope of problems in the world to despair, right? And yet, when you look at the ways that individual people can do tremendous good within the context of their own lives, I think despair is just cheap comfort. And so I do absolutely have reason to hope. I mean, I wouldn't write if I were not a hopeful person.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for this gorgeous and harrowing and capacious and really beautiful book. It was just a gift to read, and a gift to be able to talk with you today.
This was such a pleasure, and yeah, I cannot wait for 5 Wounds.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both. I'm going to use the power of the host to ask a final question of both of you all. What are you reading right now or have read recently that you would like to recommend?
Kirstin, do you want to kick us off, or?
Sure. So I'm just rereading Ross Gay's gorgeous poetry collection, Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude, and I just started Anne Enright's new novel, Actress. And I'm listening in the car to Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. So I've got a bunch of things going.
Nice. I put up a bunch of the books that I really loved from this year behind me, just because, why not? Matt Gallagher's Empire City, I feel like is like, especially with the recent news about the militia and attempt on the governor, I feel like this is like this insane alternate reality America that sort of news events make much closer. And Matt's a Iraq war vet. I'm reading this Elliot Ackerman's Red Dress in Black and White about Istanbul, which is fantastic. Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminsky. I just picked up on pub day. It's like a gift to myself, and I love that a lot. I already mentioned Akhtar, Garth Greenwell, Austin Thought by Zena Hitz, Cleanness, Yag Yassi's Transcendent Kingdom, Fire in the Blood by Perry O'Brien, Real Life, Brandon Taylor. It's been a really great year for books. All these authors have put out these amazing books, and then they don't get to go on book tour. But they're wonderful, wonderful stuff. I think it's just been a really, really rich year. So yeah, but yeah, Ilya Kaminsky is the last book that I picked. Oh, and Carlos Lozada's What Were We Thinking, where he read like 150 books around the Trump year and is like sort of going through a sort of almost intellectual history of people trying to deal with the current presidency. And he's just a really smart, fascinating critic. So I'm reading that too.
Great. Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, Kirstin. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Your patronage is really what's able to keep us bringing you programming like this. We cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Phil and Politics and Prose by using the links in the chat to purchase this wonderful book, Missionaries. Check out our website for our most up-to-date event listings. We have a big list of events coming up in October. Lots of options to check out. We do hope to see you all there. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Phil and Kirstin. Stay strong, stay safe, and stay well read, everyone. See you next time.